Everyone remembers the moment Smeagol became Gollum. That scene by the river, the glint of gold in Déagol's hand, the sudden violence, the first whisper of "my precious." It's one of the most haunting origin stories in all of fantasy. The instant a hobbit-like creature fell into corruption and began a 500-year descent into madness. But here's what almost nobody thinks about. Who was Smeagol before that moment? What kind of person picks up a ring and immediately commits murder? Was he already broken, already dark, already halfway to Gollum before the ring ever touched his hand? Or was he something else entirely? Someone whose fall reveals more about the nature of evil than the ring itself? The films give us almost nothing. A few seconds of a birthday fishing trip, a flash of violence, and then centuries of cave-dwelling horror. But Tolkien gave us more. Scattered across the appendices, his letters, and careful readings of the text, there's a portrait of Smeagol that most fans have never seen. And when you piece it together, it changes everything about how we understand not just Gollum, but the ring's power, hobbit nature, and the very mechanics of corruption in Middle-earth. These are the 5 things you probably didn't know about Smeagol before the ring found him, and by the end you'll realize that Gollum's tragedy started long before that day by the river. The first thing you need to understand is that Smeagol wasn't a hobbit. Not exactly, this sounds wrong. He looks like a hobbit in the flashbacks. He lives with creatures that seem like hobbits. Tolkien himself sometimes refers to him as a hobbit in casual descriptions. But when you dig into the actual text, the picture gets more complicated. Sméagol was a stoor. Now, if you only know the movies, that word means nothing to you. But in Tolkien's Legendarium, hobbits aren't a single homogeneous people. They're divided into 3 distinct breeds, each with their own characteristics, their own history, and their own relationship to the wider world. The Harfoots were the smallest and most numerous, the typical hobbits we see in the Shire. Brown-skinned, barefoot, lovers of hillsides and highlands. The Fallowhides were taller, fairer, more adventurous, the aristocratic strain that produced families like the Tooks and Brandybucks. And then there were the Stoors. The Stoors were different, larger than other hobbits, broader. They were the only hobbits who could grow facial hair. They preferred flatlands and riversides. They were the only hobbits who regularly used boats and had any comfort with water. And here's the crucial detail. They were the only hobbit kind who had any prolonged contact with men in the early days of their wandering. Sméagol's people, the river folk who lived near the Gladden Fields, were Stoors who had never completed the westward migration to the Shire. They stayed behind, living in the willow banks and marshlands of the Anduin, isolated for centuries from their distant cousins. By the time Sméagol was born, his people had developed their own culture, their own customs, their own way of seeing the world. This matters because it tells us something important. Sméagol wasn't raised in the Shire's cozy, communal, deeply structured society. He grew up in a smaller, more isolated community, one that had been separated from the main body of hobbit kind for over 1,000 years. The social safety nets, the elaborate family networks, the gentle civilizing pressure of Shire society, none of that existed for Sméagol. He was, from birth, already on the margins. The second thing most people miss is Sméagol's family situation, and it's darker than you'd expect. Tolkien tells us that Sméagol lived with his grandmother, who was the matriarch of a large and relatively wealthy family among the river folk. She's described as possessing a hole in a bank, a sign of status among hobbit kind, and ruling her family with an iron grip. But notice what's missing. Parents. Tolkien never mentions Sméagol's mother or father, not once. In a mythology where lineage matters enormously, where family connections define identity, where Bilbo and Frodo's family trees are documented in obsessive detail, Sméagol's parents are simply absent. He lives with his grandmother. That's all we're told. This isn't an oversight. Tolkien was meticulous about family structures. The absence of Sméagol's parents suggests something happened. Death, abandonment, disgrace. We don't know what. But we know that Sméagol was raised not by parents, but by a grandmother described as domineering and matriarchal. And here's the detail that changes everything. Tolkien specifically tells us that Sméagol was curious and inquisitive, always digging into things, always wanting to know secrets, always burrowing, literally and figuratively, into places he wasn't supposed to go. His grandmother would call him a sneak and tell him to stop prying. This isn't just childhood mischief. This is a portrait of a young person who felt excluded, who sensed that things were being hidden from him, who responded to a controlling environment by developing a pathological need to uncover secrets. Smeagol's obsession with hidden things, with burrowing, with dark places, with precious secrets kept from others, didn't start with the ring. It started in his grandmother's hole, in a family where he felt like an outsider, where he had to spy and sneak just to understand his own world. The ring didn't create Gollum's psychology. It found a psychology already primed for obsession and amplified it to monstrous proportions. The third thing you probably didn't know is that Smeagol was considered strange by his own people before the ring ever appeared. This is easy to miss because Tolkien embeds it in a single sentence, but it's crucial. When describing Smeagol's early life, Tolkien notes that he was already odd and that his habit of burrowing and sneaking made him unpopular among his relatives. Already odd, before the ring, before the murder, before any of it. Smeagol wasn't a normal, well-adjusted hobbit who was suddenly corrupted by an external force. He was a marginal figure in an already marginal community, someone whose quirks and behaviors made him an outsider even among outsiders. When he looked at the world, he already saw himself as separate from it, as someone who had to take because he would never be given, who had to hide because he was never welcomed. This reframes the entire tragedy. The ring didn't turn a happy hobbit into a monster. It found someone already wounded, already isolated, already nursing grievances against a world that seemed to reject him, and it offered him exactly what he secretly wanted. Something that was entirely his, something precious that no one could take away, something that would make him special instead of strange. The horror of Gollum isn't that the ring can corrupt anyone. It's that the ring finds the cracks that already exist and pries them open. Smeagol's cracks were deep and old. The ring just gave him permission to fall into them completely. The fourth thing almost nobody realizes is the significance of Smeagol's birthday and what it reveals about the murder of Déagol. The fishing trip where everything changed wasn't just any day. It was Smeagol's birthday. Tolkien specifies this, and he doesn't include details without reason. In Hobbit culture, and the stores, despite their isolation, retained many Hobbit customs, birthdays were sacred. But here's the key difference from how we celebrate. Hobbits didn't receive gifts on their birthdays. They gave them. The birthday person was expected to distribute presents to friends and family, a tradition that reinforced social bonds and demonstrated generosity. Now picture the scene by the river. Déagol dives underwater and surfaces with a golden ring, the most beautiful object either of them has ever seen. And Smeagol immediately says, "Give it to me. It's my birthday and I wants it." This line, which seems like simple greed, is actually a complete inversion of Hobbit values. Smeagol isn't just asking for a gift. He's demanding that a gift be given to him on the day when he should be giving to others. He's weaponizing the concept of birthday generosity, twisting it into a claim of entitlement. And Déagol, who was apparently Smeagol's friend, perhaps even his relative, refuses. He says he's already given Smeagol a gift, and this one he's keeping for himself. What happens next is the murder. But look at the psychology underneath it. Smeagol doesn't just want the ring because it's beautiful. He wants it because, in his mind, he deserves it. The world owes him. His birthday, the one day when social custom might justify receiving something, becomes the excuse for taking everything. This is entitlement twisted into violence. And again, the ring didn't create this. The ring found someone who already believed he was owed something the world refused to give him. The murder wasn't the ring's corruption. It was the first time Smeagol acted on feelings he'd been nursing for years. The fifth and perhaps most disturbing thing you didn't know is what happened immediately after the murder, and how Smeagol's community responded. Most people assume Smeagol fled into the mountains right after killing Déagol, that he grabbed the ring, ran from the scene, and began his long descent into Gollum in isolation. But that's not what Tolkien tells us. Smeagol went home. He returned to his grandmother's hole, to his community, to his family, and he stayed there. For years, he used the ring's power of invisibility to spy, to steal, to discover secrets. He became more unpleasant, more isolated, more resented. People began to notice that he muttered to himself, that he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. Gollum. Gollum. That became his nickname. His family didn't know he had committed murder. They didn't know about the ring. But they knew something was deeply wrong with him. And here's what they did about it. His grandmother kicked him out. Think about what this means. In Hobbit society, family is everything. The bonds of kinship are almost unbreakable. Even difficult relatives are tolerated, managed, incorporated into the family structure. But Smeagol became so unbearable, so toxic, so impossible to live with, that his own grandmother, the matriarch who had raised him from childhood, expelled him from the family home. Tolkien writes that she turned him out of her hole, and that he wandered alone, eventually making his way into the misty mountains. He didn't flee from justice. He was exiled from love. His family didn't punish him for murder. They rejected him for becoming something they could no longer recognize or tolerate. This is, in some ways, more tragic than a simple fall from grace. Sméagol had chances. He had years, living among his people, when he could have confessed, could have thrown away the ring, could have fought against what he was becoming. Instead, he used the ring to feed his worst impulses, the spying, the secrecy, the resentment, until even the people who had known him all his life could no longer bear his presence. By the time he entered the caves beneath the misty mountains, Sméagol had already chosen Gollum. The centuries of isolation that followed didn't transform him. They just completed what he had already begun. So what does all of this tell us? What do these 5 hidden details reveal about Tolkien's understanding of evil, corruption, and the tragedy of Gollum? The conventional reading of Gollum is that he's a victim, an innocent creature destroyed by a force beyond his control. And there's truth in that. The ring is genuinely malevolent. It does corrupt. It does possess a will of its own, an extension of Sauron's power that works to dominate and destroy anyone who carries it. But Tolkien's portrait of Sméagol before the ring complicates this. Sméagol wasn't innocent. He wasn't a happy, well-adjusted hobbit living a peaceful life until evil found him. He was already isolated, already resentful, already nursing wounds that made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of temptation the ring offered. This doesn't make Sméagol a villain. It makes him something more complex. A person whose weaknesses were exploited by a power that knew exactly how to exploit them. The ring didn't create Sméagol's hunger for secrets, his sense of entitlement, his willingness to take what he couldn't receive. It found those things and fed them until they consumed everything else. And here's the haunting implication. Sméagol's weaknesses aren't unique. The need to feel special, the resentment of those who seem to have more, the hunger for something precious that belongs only to us. These are universal shadows, present in every heart to some degree. What separates Sméagol from Bilbo, from Frodo, from Sam, isn't that they were immune to these shadows. It's that they had something Sméagol lacked: connection, community, love that held them accountable. Frodo had Sam. Bilbo had the Shire. Even Aragorn and Gandalf had networks of friendship and duty that anchored them against the ring's pull. Sméagol had no one. His parents were absent. His grandmother was controlling, not nurturing. His community tolerated him, but never embraced him. When the ring found him, he was already alone, and the ring made sure he stayed that way. This is Tolkien's deepest insight into evil. It works through isolation. It separates us from the people who might save us. It whispers that we deserve what we're taking, that we're justified in our resentments, that we don't need anyone else because we have something precious all our own. Gollum isn't just a monster. He's a warning, a portrait of what any of us could become if we let our wounds fester in isolation, if we convince ourselves that taking is the same as receiving, if we choose secrets over connection. And the saddest part? Even at the end, even on the slopes of Mount Doom, there were moments when Sméagol could have been saved. Frodo saw it. Sam almost saw it. There was still something in Gollum that remembered being a person, that wanted to be loved, that might have chosen differently if anyone had been able to reach it. But by then, the ring had done its work too well. The isolation was too complete. And Sméagol, who had spent his whole life feeling like an outsider, died the way he had lived, alone, clutching the only thing that had ever made him feel precious, falling into fire with no one to catch him. If you're walking away from this with new eyes for one of Tolkien's most tragic figures, if you'll never watch Gollum's scenes quite the same way again, then you're part of what we're building here. Subscribe to Echoes of Middle-earth for more deep dives into the stories beneath the stories. Ring that bell so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, do you think Sméagol could have been saved? Was there a moment before or after the ring when someone could have reached him? Until next time.